Hello and welcome. I am Light and this is my channel. Today we're going to discuss a very strange case. You might have heard of it before, but I want to talk about it here. And it's the death of Josh Maddux. If you haven't heard of him or how he passed away, then this will be new to you. And if you have, I hope you still enjoy this content. And speaking of that, if you would please give this video a thumbs up, I would appreciate it. If you are not subscribed and you would like to be, please go ahead and click that button. And when you do, if you choose the bell, you will be notified when my content goes live. And if you are enjoying the 31 days of Halloween, there is a thank you button down there for tips. As always, it is not necessary, but appreciated. All right, you guys, let's start talking about this, shall we? On May 8th, 2008, Joshua Maddux, who went by Josh, was 18, left his house in Woodland Park, Colorado, to take a walk. He was a nature lover, so this was nothing unusual to him. He was never seen alive again. His body was found on August 7th, 2015. 7 years after his disappearance, in August of 2015, less than a mile away from Joshua's home, a property developer named Chuck Murphy was demolishing an old wood cabin to make way for 32 new family homes. The cabin hadn't been used in years, and the inside was damp and rotten. Work to demolish the chimney inside the cabin started, and to the surprise of the demolition team, crammed inside the brickwork was a mummified body, which was later confirmed to be Josh. His body was naked apart from a thin shirt, and his clothes were neatly stacked inside the cabin. So we're going to talk about what happened to Josh. Did he climb in? Did somebody put him in? The story of Josh Maddux continues to stir debate among armchair detectives all across the internet. Joshua Maddux was born on March 9th, 1990, and he lived in Woodland Park, which is a town of around 8,000 people in the Pike National Forest, Teller County, Colorado. Joshua's parents were divorced, so he lived with his father, Mike, and two sisters, Kate and Ruth. Josh had long hair. He was 6 feet tall. His hair was blonde, and he weighed about 150 pounds. He had a carefree attitude to life. He loved music. He loved spending his free time writing music or playing his guitar. At school, he was a bright student and very well liked. 2 years before Joshua's disappearance on June 1st, 2006, a week before his high school graduation, his older brother Zachary, who was also at the time 18, committed an unaliving after suffering from severe depression. His father, Mike Maddux, said, "I buried his older brother 2 years before, and it was so difficult on Josh. When his brother died, it pushed him over the edge. It was a big shock for the family and a big shock for Josh. He thought very highly of his older brother." Despite this, 2 years on, Josh was doing well, and he was happy. By all accounts, everyone said that he was getting back to his regular self, enjoying his music, playing his guitar, just being the person who was laid back. On May 8th, 2008, Josh left his house, and he told his sister Kate that he was going out for a walk. He often went out hiking alone, so when his sister saw him in the house before he left, she thought little of it. But when he failed to return later that evening, the family became worried. On May 13th, 5 days after he disappeared, his father, Mike, called the police to report Josh missing. Mike is quoted as saying, "I got up one morning and Josh was there. Then he just never came home. The next day he still didn't come home. I called his friends, but nobody had seen him. Nobody knows where he is." Along with authorities, friends and family scoured the neighborhood and the nearby parkland area where Josh liked to go walking. After months of searching, nothing had been uncovered and hopes faded. Joshua's sister Kate hoped that he had simply left town to go and play music or start a different life. He was 18. He was an adult. Kate wrote of her brother's disappearance. Since Josh was 18, it has been reasonable to assume that he may have decided to leave town to start a new life as one of his two older sisters. I have always chosen to believe that this was the case. I have expected Josh to return home to my father's house at any time with a wife and small children so that they can meet their grandparents and their two aunts. Josh has always been known for his musical and literary talent, so maybe we would find him playing music with a band on tour, or catch him writing successful novels under a pen name so that he could keep his preferred lifestyle of solitude in the woods. The police had no reason to suspect any foul play, so they listed him as a missing person. In 2015, Chuck Murphy, who was 80 at the time, a builder from Colorado Springs, was demolishing his old wood cabin on Meadowlark Lane, which was in a large area of land surrounded by tall pine trees. Chuck had originally purchased this property and this cabin in the 1950s. It had formerly been the homestead of Thunderhead Ranch on Rampart Range Road on Woodland Park's north side. It had been, in its heyday, an infamous dining, drinking, and gambling complex owned by a guy named Big Bert Bergstrom in the 1930s to the 1950s. He had come to America from Sweden in 1912 and run the Thunderhead Inn as a dining and drinking establishment after the end of Prohibition. But he also used the ranch as an illegal gambling and prostitution den, and he was arrested by the FBI. In the subsequent trial, the jury found him not guilty. The cabin hadn't been used for years and had fallen into a state of disrepair. Chuck had made the decision to demolish the cabin to make way for property development, and in August 2015, demolition work started. Chuck's brother had lived in the cabin until 2005, but since moving out, it had become a storage facility and it had been rarely visited. Animals had been a problem, and there was a notable stench when Chuck came to the cabin on August 7th. As the workers dismantled the chimney, one of the two in the cabin at the time using an excavator and reached the interior, Chuck made the horrific discovery of the body of a young man, cramped in a fetal position with his legs above his head. He called the police, who arrived with the county coroner, who later, with the help of dental records, positively identified the body of missing young man Joshua Maddux. The Maddux family was shocked by the news of this discovery. His sister Kate said, "The situation doesn't make sense at all. We were really expecting him to be anywhere else in the world, and he was actually very close. The only thing we could figure is that he was being an 18-year-old kid checking out a cabin. It had really been abandoned for a long time, and a horrible accident happened." The cabin was actually only 2 blocks from the Maddux family home. Yet the searches for Josh had overlooked the building. There had not been any sign of life, and there was no reason to check the chimney there. Chuck Murphy, the cabin owner himself, had rarely visited. However, on the occasions that he had to check in, he himself had not noticed anything unusual about the property. Since the cabin itself stood centrally in a large plot of land surrounded by tall pine trees and about 50 feet from the road, police suggested that with no homes close by, if Josh had cried for help, no one would have been able to hear him, regardless. The Teller County coroner, Al Bourne, did an autopsy and found no evidence of any drugs in Joshua's remains. He said the hard tissue showed no signs of trauma. There were no broken bones, no knife marks, there were no bullet holes. There is, so far, no answers to a number of things. It is very confusing. It was not an instant death. How he died is only a matter of speculation, but we know that he did not starve to death, because that takes many weeks. He went on to say, so then you have to go down the chain, and you have dehydration, which could take just a few days. And the other thing possible would be hypothermia, which could take a day or two. We have no evidence to say which came first. So given that, on September 28, 2015, Bourne made a ruling of accidental death. He speculated that Josh had climbed into the chimney and become stuck in the brickwork. Bourne stated that Josh's position in the chimney appeared to have been a voluntary act in order to gain access. He concluded the most likely cause of death would be hypothermia, as the temperatures around the time of his disappearance between May 8th and 10th, 2008, had dropped to the high of the 20s. But many locals had issues with the coroner's report, including Joshua's family. Chuck questioned the coroner's conclusion of an accidental death, as the chimney had been built 20 years before, and during its construction, it had been fitted with a thick wire mesh hung from steel hooks used to keep out animals and debris, to keep them from being lodged inside the chimney or from entering the cabin itself, which could obviously, amongst other things, be a fire hazard. Murphy said it was heavy wire grade, a wire mesh. I installed it across the chimney, about one row of bricks from the top. We didn't want trouble with raccoons and things getting into the chimney. Bourne was of the opinion that the grate would have been rusted or corroded, and further stated, quote, nobody saw the metal mesh. We didn't see it in any of our photos. It may have disappeared. But Murphy responded that during the demolition, all metalwork had been collected and taken for scrap, which would explain why the mesh was not clearly identified by the coroner, as it wasn't anywhere near the chimney then. Quote, they were just gathering up all the steel, angle iron, and things as part of the demolition, Murphy said. They had no idea the mesh had any significance. So, conceding to Murphy, Bourne reopened the case 3 days after his initial conclusion. It was not only the rebar that caused doubt about the original autopsy. For example, a large wooden breakfast bar that had been torn from the wall in the kitchen and dragged over to block the chimney from inside the cabin raised further suspicions. If the breakfast bar had been torn from the wall, then who had done it, and why? And then there was the fact that Joshua's body had also been found in a fetal position with his legs above his head and disjointed from his torso. In order to have gotten into such a position, he would have had to have entered the chimney, obviously, head first. This was a fairly unusual position, and Bourne had earlier commented that he thought it would have taken 2 people to position him in such a fashion. And what was even stranger was that when Joshua's body was found, he was wearing only a thin thermal shirt, and his clothes had actually been found inside the cabin, folded up next to the fireplace. Bourne said of this evidence, this one really taxed our brains. We found his clothing just outside the firebox. He had only had on a thermal t-shirt. We don't know why he took his clothes off, took his shoes off, or his socks, and why he went outside, climbed on the roof, and went down the chimney. It was not linear thinking. And also, isn't it strange that Murphy had said that he'd gone into the cabin and hadn't seen anything unusual? He, in all those years, hadn't seen that the breakfast bar had been ripped off the wall and pushed over towards the chimney. He hadn't seen a stack of neatly folded clothes, including shoes, next to the chimney. The revised autopsy report said that the cause of death was accidental death, murder, or undetermined causes. Bourne said, we've come up with the most plausible explanation, and it will remain an accident. He did come down the chimney. That is our conclusion. How can you come to that conclusion when you've been told that it was impossible with the wire and the rebar blocking entrance into the chimney. I don't understand that. Or the fact that the coroner had made the comment that it would have had to take 2 people to put Joshua's body into that position. How can he hold both of those thoughts at the same time? This kid crawled in by himself, and also 2 people had to put him in there for him to be in that position. But Murphy said, again, there is no way that guy crawled in that chimney with that steel webbing. He didn't come down the chimney. And he remained convinced that Joshua's death had not been an accident. And he added, he was only wearing his thermal shirt, no pants, no shoes, or socks. Murphy said it was ridiculous to think that the teen stripped down to just his shirt, climbing up on the roof, and then the chimney, and then slid down, knowing he would be trapped. Police, on the other hand, received several anonymous tip-offs suggesting leads and naming suspects that had bragged of killing Joshua. One such suspect was now incarcerated in a Texas jail and had previous time in Seattle and Portland prisons with a long history of violent crime. One tip-off had informed the police that this man had been seen with Josh. When speaking of the man, Al Bourne said, quote, "They can't give me times and specifics, and we can't generate stuff that goes back 7 years." Bourne also doubted that the man would have been able to put Josh in the chimney alone. Again, exactly the point. In 2015, a post on Reddit, armchair detectives, all of them, gave a name to the suspect just mentioned. The post said, "I went to high school with this skinny, dorky hippie named Andy who played guitar in a band. I was never good friends with him or anything, but a year or so after I graduated, one of my good friends, Josh, started hanging out with him and then went missing. Turns out that in addition to becoming a lot scarier looking, Andy had indeed headed down to New Mexico, where he found himself shooting the shit with the caretaker of a disabled guy and got invited over to their apartment. Caretaker gets in the shower, and when he comes back out, the disabled guy is stabbed to death and Andy's gone. When Andy got arrested, he also claimed to have killed a woman in Taos and stuffed her body into a barrel. And, sure enough, the cops had indeed found a woman stuffed in a barrel in Taos, but already had someone in custody for it and decided to stick with that guy instead. Years later, I found out that the caretaker had died in a bar fight, and without him, the cops didn't have much in the way of evidence somehow. So, that case against Andy was dropped too." He goes on to say, "Several of us went to the cops saying, 'Yo, Josh, who went missing, was last seen with Andy, who's a murderer. Maybe you should check that out.' Despite a fair amount of pestering, nothing ever really came of it. And by nothing, I mean that the police mostly didn't even return our calls, and once accidentally canceled the bulletin on Josh because he's alive and well and living in the next town over. He wasn't. He was actually in the chimney of an abandoned cabin like 2 blocks from his parents' house. The coroner said the body had been there for about 7 years and ruled the death accidental, concluding that Josh had probably climbed down the chimney in an attempt to break into the house and gotten stuck, which, given the age of the corpse, doesn't seem overly ridiculous, except for the fact that in addition to Josh having last been seen with Andy immediately before his stabbing spree, people called in to report having heard rumors that Andy was bragging about having put Josh in a hole. Somebody had ripped a heavy bar off the wall in the kitchen and propped it against the fireplace, or the fact that Joshua's stuff was already inside the cabin, meaning A, he'd already broken in and would have had to lock himself out to have to go for the chimney, and B, he might have noticed that either the flue or the big bar would have prevented him from getting in through the fireplace. Or the fact that when he was found, Joshua's knees were above his head, which sounds to me like he would have had to go in head first. Disclaimer, not an expert at effing all. Or maybe the fact that Josh was barefoot and naked from the waist down. He continues to say, "This is just my opinion, but I don't care who you are. You don't try to climb in head first into a chimney via a hole rusted through a metal grate with your penis hanging out." As far as I could tell, nobody even bothered to call Andy to ask if he knew anything. By the way, from what I hear, Andy's still out and about doing his thing when he's not in the mental hospital. All I'm saying is, I wish they had done some police shit. Open an investigation. Try to track down some leads. Interview some of the folks who've been calling in tips for the last 7 years. Maybe check for some semen or something. I don't know. Don't just say, accidental, dust off your hands, and call it a day. As it turned out, Andy's full name was Andrew Richard Newman. He was arrested on suspicion of a fatal stabbing in New Mexico, and he is currently serving time. So, conclusions on this case. Chuck Murphy, the owner of the cabin, said, "It's a real conundrum. A tragic, terrible story. All I know is he did not go down that chimney. He got in the fireplace and went up. But why? I think it will remain a mystery. One of those sad stories." This case is bizarre and perplexing. Here's a couple questions. The rebar in the chimney would have prevented the entry of anyone unless it was removed prior to the demolition or rusted away as suggested by the coroner. But, as Murphy had said, they took out all the metal and the rebar when they did the demolition. It was there. Another question, why would Josh remove all of his clothes and leave them by the fireplace? And another is, why was the breakfast bar dragged to cover the entrance of the fireplace inside the cabin? All right, you guys, let's talk about this. Do you have any theories, any ideas, any comments? Please feel free to leave them below and start a conversation. This is an interesting one. Thank you for coming, and good night.